So let's try to predict the standard metagame for a Pro Tower OTJ. The Cowboy said, baby. I do like that we're doing a Pro Tour like a couple of weeks after the set comes out. That's actually really interesting. I have heard some pros mutter that it actually doesn't give them a whole lot of time with the new meta, so there's just going to be a lot of fallback onto old decks. And that does appear to be the case when you look at the metagame breakdown. I actually think that calling this a predictions video or segment or whatever is actually a bit of a fleece on my part. That's a bait and switch, and I shouldn't call it that, to be honest. But I got to get some views, some eyeballs on this channel. And so what I mean by that is that it looks like Esper midrange is probably gonna win. It's 31% of the field. That is an absolutely enormous make up a new word percentage of the field, man. I won't say that makes the deck a problem. I just think that what I was just saying pros were talking about is probably just objectively the case, that there's just not a whole lot of time to test with new, archetypes since the new set came out. So we're going to see a lot of fallback on this, industry standard stuff, So here's Esper midrange, 65 people on it. That is 3 times the amount of people on the deck in second place. So just a massive chunk of the meta. And I think that if you wanted to put smart money on it, you would just say Esper, right, obviously has the highest chance of not just winning the tournament, but putting like several decks in the top 8 just because of sheer numbers here. So yeah, it's a really good deck. Somebody just asked me in a comment yesterday. It was funny because they were like, I know you don't answer comments too much, but I just qualified for Dallas regional championship qualifier. And I just want to know, like, what would you do? Like, what are you thinking about standard? And I wrote him out. I responded, wrote like a whole big long comment. Like, here's what I would do. It's either Esper, Dimir, or, Azorius Control. And I mapped out all my reasons for wanting to do these decks. And ultimately I said Esper is probably the deck to take in. And apparently a lot of pros thought the exact same way. Esper is probably just the deck, but the most matchups right now, the most good matchups at the moment. And it's got a couple of different ways of playing. It can kind of just like play creature on the first few turns of the game, and then like no more lies, the Sunfall or whatever, your control opponent's just done. Or it can play a more like slightly controlling game because it's got the best removal spells and there's no more lies. And sometimes you see Wandering Emperor in this deck and you just play a little bit more methodically, and then you hit, Rafine, on a kind of mid-range turn or something like that, or Denic on a kind of mid-range turn. And you just kind of start taking over the game incrementally. So Duelist of the Mind is another way to kind of curve out into Rafine and just like makes game spiral out of control. Especially if you go first and almost no matter what you're playing against. So I just think Esper has the best lines right now. And again, apparently that was the conclusion for an awful lot of people right now. So I'm not surprised to see it in kind of the top spot as far as the decks that the pros chose. But there's other stuff to talk about. Boros has kind of seated itself as the best aggro deck in standard right now. And as you'll notice, there's only 8 people on Mono Red, 22 people on Boros Convoke. And I don't think there's really another aggro deck in here. Yeah, not really. I mean, like Dimir and Golgari they're pretty solidly mid-range decks, but they have like aggro lines, like Siren Storm Tamer into Deep Cavern Bat into Gix. Get him, like that is a line in Dimir, but it's also a pretty reactive deck. Now, when it comes to Boros Convoke versus, I guess Rakdos Aggro's in here too. A little surprising to see it above Mono Red, but Rakdos Aggro, that's going to be an interesting one to actually see. This is the Inti, and I guess they've added Forsaken Miner, so that's a new card. But it'll be interesting to see like what evolutions this deck has taken, because it's probably just like the Blood Tithe Harvester and Friends deck. Right, obviously see Inti in here, kind of the mono black splash red, go a little bit more aggro, and again, get them. So, interesting choice for 8 players, but there's really only one real aggro deck in best of 3 standard. It's Boros Convoke, that's why there's 10% of people on it. We'll see if it's a good choice. It is famously Deece against Esper, so we'll see about it. Teamer Analyst, huge chunk of the field, just under the best aggro deck, right? 9.2%, it's actually great. That's so good. One new deck is surprising. I actually think it's more than that. We'll get to why in just a moment. But Teamer Analyst, and I won't call this a new deck, right? We've seen this deck before. And it's been performing sort of on and off. But for it to get this many pro players sort of to choose it, going into the Pro Tour, that's actually, to me, like a massive evolution in, how the deck is seen. in the format. I think that the deck has moved from the fringes and has been garnering more and more respect. But to see 19 different pros at the biggest event of the year, like, respected this much is honestly a bit of a surprise to me. Almost 1 out of 10 players chose this deck in a field where there's like, 15, 20 decks to choose from. So actually kind of amazing that this is World Souls Rage, by the way. And it says Teamer Analyst. It's World Souls Rage. Although Aftermath Analyst is kind of the best card in the deck. Like, once you have the mana for it, it's like Analyst, immediately Splendid Reclamation. Suck it. It's a really, really good card. But again, just kind of surprised that it's all the way up here above some of the other stuff, like Domain Ramp, and Azorius Control, for that matter. But 4-Color Legends is next. A lot of people respecting this deck, too. Again, to see this above decks like Domain Ramp and Azorius Control, actually super surprising, Like, if best I can tell, yeah, this is the Slogurk deck, and they've added Honest Rutstein. That means that it might run the Rona Relic of Legends Honest Rutstein, like, Infinite Loop. And if so, massive step up for this deck and kind of a brand new iteration of it. But obviously Slogurk was a good deck last season, especially against the Azorius Control matchup, and maybe a lot of pros knew that there would be a bunch of people on this deck, and that's why we don't see so many people on Azorius Control, because Boros Convoke and 4-Color Legends are kind of the worst matchups for Control right now. Esper's not the best matchup either for Control, to be honest. So I do think Azorius gets like really, really good in game 2, but they have issues against Analyst. You'd think they would not, but they actually have serious problems against like Colossal Sky Turtle and the Green Virtue, like looping. Like they have real issues with that. And against 4-Color Legends, Slogurk loops just demolish them because they can't counter, aside from Tidebinder, they can't really counter like channeling the legendary lands and then getting them back with Slogurk and all that stuff. And those are loops that just like destroy Control. So I can see maybe that's why there's fewer players on Azorius, but I do think it's one of the stronger decks going into the weekend if so many people aren't on this 3 chunk of decks right here. And Azorius, I say that Boros is a bad matchup for it, but games 2 and 3 Azorius can kind of make up that gap a little more than it can against these 2 decks. Domain Ramp, on the other hand, this is, experiencing a little bit of a meta shift. I think some people would call this in the top 3 decks. Before MKM came out. Really, since MKM, this deck's been sliding. But it's definitely still in the top, 5, decks in the format. But I'm not sure it's the absolute best plan anymore. This also beats Azorius sometimes, but a smart Azorius player will not lose to a Domain Ramp deck, and I think these are all smart players. And I know that that's not a very objective-sounding statement, but, so long as you know when and where to use your sweepers in this matchup as the Azorius Control player, I think you should be fine against Domain Ramp, especially again game 2 and 3, when you know that it's ramp. So I think that's going to help an awful lot. But them landing a big creature, them actually resolving Atraxa through Cavern of Souls can just draw them 4 cards and put the game out of reach. So it's not all about just like, oh, you played Atraxa and you have herd migration, I'm going to use my sweepers smartly. It's not all about that, but again, this is almost a 50-50 match that I think that a smart Azorius player is like slightly edged out to win in. But still, we've basically been talking about Azorius Control this whole time anyway, so good segue into that. Again, a little surprised there weren't more people on this deck, and that might be a factor of it being so early in the season too. Control has not had a whole lot of time yet to kind of adjust to the format. It doesn't really know what answers to play in the main or the board. It's got 75 slots, and every single time a new set comes out, it has to adjust, and maybe pro players just aren't confident that Azorius has had enough time to develop in this new format yet. It doesn't really know what it's responding to, right? Plus, again, as I've outlined, there's a couple of decks that just completely body it that are slightly better than it right now. Dimir mid-range down here, 9 people on this. Again, a little surprised to see kind of a lowish deck count here. I think a lot of people think that everything Dimir does, Esper does better, and I think they're probably right in a vacuum, but adding that 3rd color is like a real thing. But now we just got some more lands for Esper, and maybe that makes the difference, right? Getting fast lands for Esper makes it to where Dimir is a little less desirable now, because that difference in consistency has, narrowed slightly. So that definitely works out in Esper's favor, but I still really like Dimir midrange as a deck right now. I think it answers a lot of different stuff very effectively. And it has multiple game plans. I think it's really important to have sort of multiple game plans in current standard, and that's why Esper is so strong. When it comes to Rakdos aggro, this isn't a brand new deck. It's kind of been iterating and iterating and iterating really ever since, Midnight Hunt or Crimson Vow. It must have been Crimson Vow whenever Blood Tithe Harvester came out. But from vampires all the way up to, Discover sort of aggro decks that play Breach the Multiverse at the top end. And I know it's not an aggro deck anymore, but there's these sort of Rakdos ramp decks. We've seen a lot of different Rakdos in the format in just the last couple of years here. The most recent iteration is this kind of Deep Cavern Bat Inti thing. That often plays Gix. It's kind of a version of Dimir that just doesn't play as reactive and just tries to go a little bit more all in. And I do respect that, but I don't think Inti's quite as good of a card as a lot of people seem to think they are. So I don't know. Interesting choice for a lot of people, and I can see playing this one along with a deck like maybe 4-Color Legends or Teamer Analyst, because these are decks that haven't had quite, or at least the current iterations of these decks haven't had as much time to be tested against, not as much as known about these matchups. They're not as, they have the ins and outs have not been studied as much with these matchups, just through a natural course of playing the game. So maybe it makes sense to pick something that less people are prepared for. I've studied the Esper match, I've studied the Domain match, I've studied the Control matchup. I've even studied the Analyst matchup, the World Souls Rage deck, but I haven't really studied the Rakdos aggro matchup, and I could see that working out, but I don't know that it's the best pick. Mono Red is... Slickshot is good, okay? Slickshot is a very, very good card. And there's obviously lines that just kill your opponent. If you haven't seen the Twinferno lines with Monstrous Rage, that just deal 13 damage or whatever all at once. It's pretty gross, but I still think that Boros Convoke is the stronger aggro deck in the format right now. Especially, this is something I didn't mention with Boros Convoke, but I want to get in here. There aren't a whole lot of decks on this list. What are there? Well over 100 decks or something at this event. And only 10 of them on this list are playing temporary lockdown. That we can tell, right? Maybe Esper has it in the board, but I don't think so. From what I've seen so far. So a deck like Boros Convoke, I think, is really, really, really good in a format where you don't have to worry about lockdown as much. You don't have to worry about other arena e-cards like Pat's Apparel or Brotherhood's In, and you just don't have to worry too much about those. Teamer Analyst is now shifted to playing, obviously it plays a sweeper in Ill-Timed Explosion, but it also plays 2 copies of Vampire's Vengeance. And that you might have to worry about if you're Boros Convoke, right? So there is that. But there just aren't a million sweepers in Standard, and the deck that plays 4 temporary main deck lockdowns or whatever is there's only 10 players at the whole event on that card. So that's really interesting if you are an aggro player, and I want to point that out. But Golgari Midrange is up next. I just don't think this is a great deck right now. It got some good stuff, I guess, in the new set, but of all the mid-range decks in the format, I think this is the one with the least real dimension, although it always surprises me. This deck long games a little bit better than I think it long games. Because every time I play against it, I'm like, oh, okay, this will be all right. And then it's not, they're still getting Aclazotzes and Sheldrids and transforming the Aclazotzes, and they have Restless Cottages, and that's horrible in the late game. They just breach the multiverse. Sometimes they play that freaking card. It's crazy. They play Virtue of Persistence, and I'm out of cards, can't do anything about it, so they just win the game. Mosswood Dread Knight draws them 6 cards in a game. So the deck does have some sort of long game power, but I just think that every deck we've looked at so far on the list, save maybe 2 or 3, are just better than Golgari right now in terms of positioning. Dimir Control is not a deck. It's not a deck. I'm amazed there's 5 people on this. I might come to bite these words, and there's reasons why this deck is better than Azorius Control right now, but I'm not seeing it. I'm not seeing it, man. You get Breach in the late game, and I think some of these decks are playing Breach as a late game win condition or whatever, but I just don't do it, man. Again, hopefully these people aren't 5 out of the top 8, all 5 people on Dimir Control. It can be very tough to predict an event, but I would be very proud of the deck if this puts one in the top 8. I don't think this is a great choice, but I will say it's got the same thing going for it as some of the aggro decks and stuff, and some of the more fringe decks that we're seeing, in that, nobody studied for this matchup. You may have studied for the Blade, but did you study for the Nerf gun? No, you didn't. So, maybe. And then other is the category that most intrigues me. There are 25 people in this category, and I really, really want to know how many of them are the Blue-White Artifacts deck. I think it's a few. I bet there's a couple of people on various kind of infinite combo reanimator decks, like the Abuelo's Awakening Rakdos joins up Hulking Metamorph thing. There's probably a couple of those going around, right? But there might be some spicy stuff in there that we have just never seen, baby. The Props Eidetic Memory deck with Duelist of the Mind is kind of popping off slightly, ever so slightly. So like maybe that's in there. I just really want to know what the garbage is, you know, or maybe there's like some Simic cookies, like some decks that we already know about, right? Green, blue artifacts and stuff like that. I'm not saying there's everything in there is unknown, but I'm really hoping we get some just cheddar cheese in that other category, baby. I hope it's not all blue-white artifacts, but I do want to know how many there are. I have seen rumblings from certain pros on Twitter about a Bronco combo deck. They call it Bronco combo. Apparently that uses Caustic Bronco. I have seen a few decks play this card on Arena, and I have never really taken any of them very seriously. There's some that play like Slip Out the Back and Shore Up to keep their Bronco in play, and it's cute. There's some that play Gix on 3 to synergize with the Bronco and like crew it, mount it, saddle it, whatever. But one that I heard people talking about today on Twitter that intrigued me actually is two people talking about Pro Tour sort of getting ready for the Pro Tour and choosing a deck. Two people were talking about Caustic Bronco and Steel Seraph, which is not an interaction that I'd considered. Caustic Bronco is when it attacks, look at the top card of your library and put it into your hand, and you lose life equal to its mana cost, like a Dark Confidant. But if it was saddled when it attacked, your opponent loses that life instead. So what you do is you play Caustic Bronco on 2, Steel Seraph on 3, give the Caustic Bronco flying, get in, saddled because you tapped your Steel Seraph. Just a pretty obnoxious interaction. You deal a bunch of damage to your opponent, and you draw a card, and you have a Steel Seraph in play, which is formidable. So just, again, not an interaction I considered, but apparently a few pros considered that deck. Which means that we should consider that deck, because it sounds really fun. But altogether, again, if I had to just predict the Pro Tour, Quan said something to me. We don't know. Yeah, I said, dang, Esper's a problem. Can't wait to see that juicy 12.1% other category, though. And Quan was like, we don't know if it's a problem yet. Could also have been the safest or most proven option early in testing. And that's kind of what I've been trying to say. He's right. That's kind of what I've been trying to say. Let me give it a little like right here. He's, as usual, Power Dragon's 100% correct. I think it was the safest, most tested option, you know. The most time has been grinded into getting games with this deck just over the last like 2 years, like ever since Rafine came out. So yeah, I just think it's the most known entity in the format. When 4-Color Legends won, when CFT Sock won with 4-Color Legends in that huge tournament a month and a half ago, 6 weeks ago, I believe he said, but it may have just been someone talking about that tournament, some pro or another, but I think maybe it was CFT, said that, you know, right now we know that Esper is the pillar of Standard. And we know a couple of other decks, like aggro decks, like Boris Convoke, right? But aside from that, we know nothing about Standard. And that little quote has kind of stuck with me. I wish I could remember who exactly said it, but the quote itself has stuck with me because, yeah, it's kind of true. We don't know that much about Standard, despite everyone thinking Standard is this like super solved format. But one thing we do know, the flip side of that, is one thing we do know is that Esper is a pillar of the format, and apparently we see the proofs in the banana pudding right there. 65 players on a stinking deck. So again, if I had to make a prediction, bringing it back around to that, like a good YouTuber, I would say that Esper puts like 3 decks in the top 8. Right, but do not despair. Maybe we'll get some juicy fruit in the other category. Maybe, you know, fringe decks like Dimir Control or Rakdos Aggro or something kind of move up the ranks. Maybe Teamer Analyst will, you know, put 5 copies in the top 4, and then they'll, you know, have to ban World Souls Rage or something. Who knows what's going to happen. Maybe 4-Color Legends will pop off and be one of the better decks of the tournament. I'm really kind of hoping for that, to be honest. So, oh, hot dog, hot diggity dog. One of the biggest Pro Tour events I can remember, like, really anticipating in a really long time. So, starts tomorrow, everybody. Probably around the time I upload this video, it's going to be out. So, it's going to be started. So, you know, let me know if you're watching this on the YouTube, because I'm pretty sure it's going to make that platform. Just let me know, like, what you think is going to happen at this format. Are you actually going to come in? Are you going to kick in the door with your cowboy boots and your spurs on with a little sprig of something in your mouth? Like some straw or something like that, like this town ain't big enough for all of us, and you walk in there with your little Elves deck in standard that doesn't even play Voha, and you just crush everybody. Number one, baby. We are the champions. Pro Tour over. So maybe that's what happens. I don't know. It could happen. Maybe Stone Cold comes in with a chair. So there's a lot of things that could happen at this tournament. Just let me know kind of how you feel about all the slop happening in OTJ Standard, Cowboy, and I'll catch you cats later. I'm Deb from The Place. Check out the Patreon. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.